Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. Paul's.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, we are debating at third reading Bill C-2, an act to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act.
Suggestions for the name of this bill. It could be called the Refusal to Honour the Ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada Bill. Or how about the Pursuing Ideology versus Evidence Act? Or how about the Refusal to Save the Lives of People with Addictions Act? This bill was introduced in response to the Supreme Court of Canada 2011 ruling that Insight in Vancouver's downtown east side had been proven to save lives, reduce harm, and that the government's efforts to close Insight would violate Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to life, liberty, and the security of the person. It is clear that the government didn't like this ruling and therefore has tried to go about refusing to honor the ruling by another route. It is clear also that this bill does not fulfill the spirit of the court's ruling. Rather, it makes it so cumbersome for a group or a municipality to apply for a Section 56 exemption to the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act, which allows the facility to operate, that the likelihood of any future sites opening in Canada becomes slim to none. Making matters worse, Insight in Vancouver will have to apply for a renewal based on the same 26 different criteria as new applications, as well as 2 additional provisions. Section 56 of the CDSA gives the Minister of Health discretionary powers to grant exemptions from the Act under one of 3 categories: medical purposes, scientific purposes, or in the public interest. 2 types of exemptions that have been granted for activities with illicit substances are: 1, law enforcement purposes to train sniffer dogs using seized drugs, public interest, or 2, to allow the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority to operate Insight, initially for scientific purposes, but since the Supreme Court's decision, considered a medical exemption. The government's intentions have been clear from the beginning. It's always opposed Insight and has been trying to close it down since they formed government. Thankfully, the work of the community in Vancouver and the courts had stopped these attempts. I would also like the opportunity to thank the member from Vancouver Centre and the Liberal Party of Canada, health critic, for her tireless efforts on this file to ensure that public policy is based on evidence and not ideology. This is an ideological bill based on crass political motivation from a government that has always opposed evidence-based harm reduction measures, such as safe injection sites. Only an hour after the legislation was introduced, Conservative campaign director Jenny Byrne issued a crass and misleading fundraising letter to supporters stating that the Liberals and the NDP want addicts to shoot up heroin in the backyards of communities all across the country. Despite this bill being tabled by the Minister of Health, it was given to an enforcement department and committee, Public Safety and Security. This is further evidence of the government's view of addiction as a criminal act. The Public Safety and Security Committee heard witnesses for 3 meetings, with many expressing concern that this bill will effectively shut down the current safe consumption site in Vancouver and deny the creation of further sites. There were amendments suggested by the Province of British Columbia, the Chief Public Health Officer of British Columbia, and the City of Vancouver, which were consistent with the Supreme Court of Canada criteria. Even witnesses in favour of the legislation expressed concern that in some parts the legislation is too restrictive. Over 60 amendments were moved by the opposition parties to bring this legislation in line with the Supreme Court ruling. However, the legislation, as usual, was not amended. Liberals proposed amendments to the Legislation Committee to amend Clause 5, which outlines the criteria that new and existing applicants for exemptions must submit, by deleting measures that were not outlined in the Supreme Court ruling. Due to a motion passed by the Conservative majority of the Public Safety Committee, a party could only have 5 minutes to speak for each clause of the bill while moving amendments. Clause 5, which is the majority of the legislation, required several amendments. Due to the time constraints, the Liberal Party was unable to speak to the majority of the amendments as time had elapsed. This is undemocratic and restricted our right to speak and to explain our amendments at committee. Liberals recognize the need for some form of legislation based on the Supreme Court of Canada ruling. However, this legislation does not respect the spirit nor the intent of the court decision. As stated in the 2011 Supreme Court ruling, quote, "The factors considered in making the decision on an exemption must include evidence, if any, on the impact of such a facility on crime rates, the local conditions indicating a need for such a supervised injection site, the regulatory structure in place to support this facility, and the resources available to support its maintenance and expressions of community support or opposition," end quote. Instead of the 5 criteria listed in the Supreme Court of Canada ruling, C-2 lists 26 different prescriptive criteria that must be met, including the areas that are intrusive into provincial and municipal jurisdiction. It also interferes with the jurisdiction of regulatory bodies on healthcare providers, as well as provincial and municipal police forces and provincial public health officers. Liberals support the need for broad community consultation with the establishment of any safe consumption site, which is how the Liberal government established Canada's first safe consumption site in Vancouver's downtown east side. The Liberal government gave the exemption to Vancouver's safe consumption. When the Liberal government gave the exemption to Vancouver's safe consumption site, we consulted broadly and worked in conjunction with provincial and municipal governments, public health authorities, business associations, and the public. Insight was the product of cooperative federalism. Local, provincial, and federal authorities combined their efforts to create it. The Vancouver Police support Insight, as well as the City of Vancouver and the British Columbia government. It was initially launched as a scientifically based research project based on experience with SCS in Europe and Australia on very high at-risk and resistant group that had proven to be successful. It has saved lives and improved health without increasing the incidence of drug use and crime in the surrounding area. Insight sees an average of 700 to 800 visits a day and over 275,000 visits annually. As of March 2010, there had been over 1.5 million visits, over 12,000 unique individuals registered, and an average of 11 visits per month per person. It has been proven to reduce harm. A total of 2,395 overdoses since the facility opened, with 0 fatalities. 20,000 referrals to health services in 2008, 2009, and over 50,000 of those were to detox. Insight users are 30% more likely to engage in addiction treatment than non-Insight users. It's also dramatically reduced the rate of new HIV infections in the downtown east side. 3 in 10 injection drug users in the downtown east side are HIV positive. 18% of Insight clients are HIV positive. There were 30 new HIV cases in the downtown east side in 2011 compared to 2,100 new cases in 1996. I'd like to highlight the 4 pillars of any effective drug strategy: harm reduction, prevention, treatment, and enforcement. This bill underlines its government's misguided decision to remove harm reduction from the equation and from a effective drug strategy. As Liberals, we support evidence-based policies that reduce harm and protect public safety. Liberals established Vancouver's Safe Consumption Site, which has proven to be effective in supporting those with mental illness and addictions, reducing crime, and protecting public safety. Across Canada, medical officers of health like David McEwen in my home community of Toronto need this as a public health approach to get on with creating new life-saving facilities such as this. Unfortunately, this bill raises the criteria to establish a safe injection site to such extraordinarily high level that it will be nearly impossible for any future site to be established in Canada. Legislation proposed in this House must adhere to the rule of law. This ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada was clear. This legislation will put lives at risk and will likely be challenged in the courts again. We cannot support this legislation. To put it bluntly, you cannot help people if they're dead. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliament Secretary and Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I did listen to my honourable colleague, and I know she has a huge passion on this issue. But to be quite honest, I have listened to the opposition for many hours now in terms of this debate, and I look at the framework that we've provided, and the framework being very practical, very appropriate around community input, and I have to liken it again to a zoning reapplication that municipal councillors regularly hear when something's proposed, having some basic health and safety measures in place. So again, to me, you know, this is very appropriate, and I'll ask her, does she not think that, you know, the community should be consulted, that there should be criminal record checks done, that there should be the powers of inspection? Again, concrete, practical steps that look at the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling and ensure that the minister has appropriate information when she makes a decision around an exemption.
The Honourable Member for St. Paul's.
Thank you very much. I thank my colleague for the question. The issue is actually that community consultation has always been part and was indeed essential to the success of the Vancouver Downtown East Side site. It was consulting the community. It was with the support and the efforts of all three levels of government and the local police. What is more than irritating about this bill is that instead of using the 5 criteria that was listed in this Supreme Court ruling, these 26 new prescriptive criteria that must be met is actually intrusive into provincial and municipal jurisdiction, and also interferes with the jurisdiction of the regulatory bodies on healthcare providers, as well as interfering with the choices of provincial and municipal police forces and provincial public health officers. It's clear this government just doesn't want these things to happen. Communities want them to happen. The government should get out of the way.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
I truly appreciate the comments from my colleague, and just wanted to know if she can maybe expand on what I think is a very important issue during this debate, and that is that we do have a very highly successful injection site that was built on consultation. That there were individuals that came from the community, that lived in the community, to different levels of government, whether it was the provincial, municipal. She made reference that this was, in fact, I think it might have been during Paul Martin, possibly Jean Chrétien, when it actually was put into place. But the point is that there was a great deal of consultation that ultimately made this happen. And at the end of the day, that it would be ridiculous for anyone to believe that there would be an injection site anywhere placed in Canada without consultation done in the first place, that the legislation is just not necessary in order to ensure that there's consultation, because we've seen that in Canada's one and only site.
The Honourable Member for St. Paul's.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question. It's actually two things. One is this is actually just tabled in order to get in the way of having any more sites. It's just obstruction, and the government and all people watching this will know exactly what's going on here. The second thing is, of course, there has to be consultation anyway, and that municipalities, the provinces, they know how to do this, and they've always done it with the cooperation of the police. This is an institution that has saved lives. When you think 2,395 people overdosed at this site with 0 fatalities, this is just mean and offensive to actually think that those 2,395 people could have died instead of being there where they were resuscitated, and I just don't get it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Thunder Bay Rainy River.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think my Liberal friend would agree that with this bill, the Conservatives are taking Canada in the wrong direction. After 10 years in office, of course, we know and we see that the Conservatives have done environmental, social, and economic damage to Canada, and that this bill is just another good example of that happening. I wonder if the member would agree.
The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Well, again, I thank the member for the question. This is, again, just purely ideologically driven instead of evidence-based, and it is in all aspects of the way this government goes, choosing ideologically based, pandering to their base, rather than actually doing the things that save lives, save money, and actually are in the right direction. I think this government doesn't understand it. So many people suffering from addictions are victims of child abuse. The kinds of things that have ended them up on the wrong path and this unhealthy path is because they haven't been able to trust people in authority in their lives, whether it's people in their homes, the teachers, these kinds of things. Insight provided an opportunity for somebody to see a way through, to develop a therapeutic relationship with a healthcare provider for probably the first time in their lives, that's allowed them to get in to addiction treatment, allowed them actually to get into safe housing. This is the way you create safer communities, and that's why the title of this bill is really, really offensive.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Yukon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think most Canadians do understand the challenges with addictions, and I think most communities and people in them understand the value that some of these sites and services can provide. But, Mr. Speaker, they also understand that there is a need for criminal record checks, that there's a need for community consultation, that there's a need for treatment service plans, so that it's not just a place where you can safely do drugs, but it's a place where you can actually effectively move toward getting off them. These parameters and the criteria that are outlined not only provide for safety, health, and security of the people that are going there for support and for their health, they're also there to provide safety and assurances to the community. That only emboldens and strengthens the integrity of sites like this, community support for sites like this. It's not members of Parliament that are against these sites. They generate some level of anxiety and concern in communities. We're responding to that with solid criteria, and that criteria will only serve to strengthen the ability of these sites across the country and confidence in Canadians in the integrity of them where they exist in those communities. And where that integrity can't be met, Mr. Speaker, where that work isn't done and where the quality of care isn't there, those sites shouldn't be available because it's not ultimately good for the people that could use them. And can the member not understand that integrity in these systems is critical for the benefit of the people that are going to use them? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that the member opposite should understand that respect for local authorities, respect for the provinces, for the medical officers of health, for your local police, that this bill gets in the way of giving respect to those authorities that make these decisions based on evidence, instead of this government that is imposing top-down an actual 26 different prescriptive criteria that are almost impossible to meet. This is very thinly veiled as just an obstruction to getting on with what will save lives because of this ridiculous ideology that kills people.